Welcome to Train Signal. This is the Forefront Threat Management Gateway Firewall Rules lesson in the Forefront Threat Management Gateway 2010 training course. Firewalls have been around for a long time, and Threat Management Gateway can replace your existing firewall. Therefore, it's important to understand some of the basic firewall functionality that you can find in Threat Management Gateway. And to that end, we'll start with a discussion about managing the various networks that are connected to your Threat Management Gateway system. Next, we'll talk about some of the web proxy authentication options you have at your disposal. And then we'll discuss the differences between route versus network address translation, or NAT relationships on TMG. Next, we'll discuss rule types that you can add to your Threat Management Gateway system, and then make sure that you understand the order of the rules on TMG and the operational impact that the rule order has. From there, we'll move on to discuss some firewall policy actions and give you some tips for managing rules on your firewall. And we'll wrap up with a short discussion about Threat Management Gateway log file management. GlobalMantics currently operates traditional firewalls, and these firewall administrators need to map their existing firewall skills to the Threat Management Gateway way. As an edge firewall, TMG will protect key GlobalMantics systems from outside attacks. By the end of this lesson, you'll learn how Threat Management Gateway handles traditional firewall tasks, and you'll understand the effect that configuration decisions have on traffic patterns in your organization. When we set up Threat Management Gateway for this course, you got an introduction to the networking option that's available in the system. We specifically chose a particular network type that includes internal and external network adapters, and we add a perimeter network for GlobalMantics. Later in this course, we're also going to create what I'm calling an audit network, and you're going to get to see how we create that network from start to finish when we have to worry about how we're going to be testing some of Threat Management Gateway's limitations later on. But to start with, Threat Management Gateway is comprised of a number of networks. The external network, which is usually the internet, the internal network, which is generally your internal LAN, the local host, which is the Threat Management Gateway server itself, a perimeter network, which is also called a DMZ or demilitarized zone, which is common in firewall parlance. And then we have two VPN-based networks, Quarantined VPN Clients Network and VPN Clients Network. And we'll discuss these two networks later in this course when we discuss virtual private networks. Obviously, the exact networks that you have really depend on your network design. You may or may not have a perimeter network. Some organizations have everything on the internal network, although this is considered less secure. And as I mentioned, you can create additional networks as necessary. So if you have to create an additional internal network or a second DMZ or perimeter network, you can do that with Threat Management Gateway simply by adding an additional network adapter. And again, we're going to create an audit network later in this course. When it comes to managing networks, there's a number of different configuration options you have at your disposal. And we're going to go over to the Threat Management Gateway system for GlobalMantics and take a look at what it takes to configure a network in Threat Management Gateway in just a second. What you're looking at on the screen are the tabs that are available when you configure a network in the Threat Management Gateway console. On the Addresses tab, you'll configure the IP addresses that are associated with the network. On the Domains tab, you'll have to tell the Threat Management Gateway server which domains are internal for your organization so that different rules are applied to traffic that's going to those domains. For this course, this is just globalmantics.com. On the Web Browser tab, this is where you're going to tell Threat Management Gateway how to handle traffic coming from web proxy clients. You can configure TMG so that clients automatically discover their settings, their proxy settings, and their Threat Management Gateway settings. And you can enable or disable automatic discovery of these settings via a tab in the network configuration area. When we installed clients, you actually got to see the Forefront Threat Management Gateway Client tab in action. This is where you configure client settings for clients that are going to reside on a particular network. In the example we used in the clients lesson, we managed the internal network client settings. On the Web Proxy tab, configure the port on which Threat Management Gateway will listen for web proxy requests, and then tell TMG how to handle authentication for this purpose. Two things that we're not going to be discussing in this course, but I want to mention here. One is called CARP, which is the Cache Array Routing Protocol settings for the network. This is basically a way the Threat Management Gateway can balance requests. as is network load balancing, which is actually a more common load balancing technique. I'm now going to go over to the Threat Management Gateway system so that you can see these settings and where to manage them. And here we are in the Threat Management Gateway console, and as you can see, I've already taken the liberty of going to the networking area, and I have the Networks tab selected. And as you can see, we've got a list of a number of networks here, and the ones that we talked about previously. And I've also got a test network that I'm using for testing. However, I'm interested in the internal network. So I'm going to right-click the internal network and choose Properties. And you're going to see that we have those 8 tabs that I talked about. We have the General tab. The Addresses tab is where you can add start and end addresses or adapters or what have you. On the Domains tab, this is where we're going to specify which domain belongs to this internal network. Basically, when machines connect to systems that are in this domain, they're not going to use Threat Management Gateway settings. Then we have our web browser configuration settings. How do we want to handle web browsers that come through the Threat Management Gateway system? Do we want to allow systems to directly access computers specified in the Domains tab or in the Addresses tab, which you saw before? So if somebody browses by IP address to an internal system, do we really want Threat Management Gateway rules applied? And once again, directly access these servers or domains, we can add the GlobalMantics domain to this list, which I've done. Next, we have our auto discovery settings, which we'll be discussing elsewhere in this course, but here we have publish automatic discovery information for this network. We discussed the client information in the client lesson in this course, including telling the client where to find its configuration settings and different ways that it can find it. Next, we want to enable web client connections for this network, yes. And here's the port on which these web proxy settings will communicate. Then we have CARP, which I discussed before, which is disabled, the cache array routing protocol, and network load balancing, which is also not enabled currently. So let's talk about some of the web proxy authentication options you have at your disposal. There are basically 5 different options that you get with Threat Management Gateway. The first one is a digest option, which works only with Windows 2000 and Windows 2003 domain accounts. This may require accounts to store passwords as encrypted text. The integrated option, which is the default, is the most secure option that we have as a default option. This is where user passwords are encrypted and secure for clients. The basic authentication option is the least secure. Passwords actually traverse the network with no encryption, basically in the clear. And passwords can be easily intercepted. So they only use this option if you absolutely have to and you have no other option. Basic is the worst authentication option you can choose. SSL certificate is a very secure option because it uses client certificates for authentication. And then Radius, which is a very common standards-based authentication option, authenticates against a chosen Radius server. It's also insecure. Passwords are transmitted in the clear. One of the basic networking concepts that you need to understand with Forefront Threat Management Gateway is the difference between a routing relationship and a network address translation or NAT relationship. Route relationships provide basic router-like functionality, and they allow you to connect 2 separate networks to one another via the router. When it comes right down to it, a firewall is just a router on steroids. It's a router with lots of additional functionality behind it. A route relationship is also bidirectional. If a network rule defines a route from an internal network, for example, to the perimeter network, then an implicit route is also created from the perimeter network to the internal network to enable bidirectional communication. When it comes to access rules, IP addresses are not masked or modified in any way. And Forefront Threat Management Gateway forwards the traffic with the source and destination IP addresses intact. Now, what that means is that when you are routing, you don't have to hide the IP address. So if I'm talking to a machine in the perimeter network, and I'm talking from the 10.1.1 network, which is the internal network for GlobalMantics, the destination machine will see a 10.1.1 address as the source address. This is different than NAT, and we'll talk about NAT soon. When it comes to publishing rules, Threat Management Gateway's application filters are used directly in a route relationship. Let's go over and take a look at where you can find these application filters just so that you know where they are. And here we are, once again, over at the Threat Management Gateway system. And you'll notice that I've selected the System tab in the navigation area. And over here you're going to see 3 tabs: Servers, application filters, and web filters. Choosing application filters, you can get a look at all of the application filters that are available with Threat Management Gateway. If you double click a filter, some of them have options that you can configure the filter. For example, the H323 filter has call control and a networks tab so that you can manage how this filter is going to listen on the network for calls that use this particular technology. But you're going to also see that a number of the filters don't have any configuration options except to enable or disable the filter. If you look at the SMTP command filter, you'll notice that you can disable and enable specific SMTP commands if you want, or you can edit them. GlobalMantics doesn't have any need to make any modifications at this point to the application filters, but I wanted you to understand where to find them and some of the options that are available. Now let's talk about network address translation relationships, or NAT relationships. NAT relationships are unidirectional rules. That is, they're set up to be one-way affairs only. You have two different kinds of rules in general that you can create in Threat Management Gateway, an access rule and a publishing rule, and each one handles NAT slightly differently. When you create an access rule, what happens after that is that Threat Management Gateway, when traffic passes through it, replaces the client IP address on the source network with Threat Management Gateway's default IP address on the destination network. So if you're on the internal network and you're browsing out to the internet, you're going to have a situation where destination machine that's being communicated with will actually see the IP address from the Threat Management Gateway system instead of the IP address from the host system, the originating system. On publishing rules, the client and the destination network makes a connection to the Threat Management Gateway IP address on which the publishing rule is listening for requests. This is a situation, for example, where you've published a web server from the perimeter network out to the internet. So that machine that's out on the internet is connecting to the Threat Management Gateway IP address, not necessarily directly to the web server. When TMG forwards traffic to the published server, the IP address, the Threat Management Gateway IP address, is then replaced with the IP address of the internal server that is being published. But the source IP address is never modified because it's always that originating machine from out on the internet. There are a number of different rule types that you can specify in Threat Management Gateway, and the first one is a network rule. And these kinds of rules are evaluated first as Threat Management Gateway makes a determination about whether a particular kind of traffic or a particular traffic request is allowed. Network rules are intended to allow you to specify if or and how resources are able to communicate between networks. When you create a network rule, you have to specify the relationship, routing or NAT, between the source and the destination networks. I'm going to go over to the Threat Management Gateway system now and give you a look at where network rules are configured. Here we are at the console, and I've selected networking, and I've selected the Network Rules tab from the networking navigation area. You're going to see that right now I have 6 rules. The first one is local host access. This is a route that allows the local host to access all networks. Basically, this says that the Threat Management Gateway server can go anywhere it wants with no restriction. So, it's because I'm remoted into the Threat Management Gateway server right now, I can browse to the internet, and none of my other rules that I've created have any effect because network rules are evaluated first. This gives me the opportunity to say that the local host can just go wherever it likes. You'll notice that we also have an internet access rule. And the test network, which I've created, is for testing only. The internal network, the quarantine network, and the VPN clients networks are allowed to access the external network for the purposes of internet access, although they're still subjected to other Threat Management Gateway rules as well. Again, this rule is evaluated before any of the other rules in Threat Management Gateway, so it basically says this traffic is allowed, but you're still going to make sure that there are not other system policy or web access policy rules that are in place that might restrict this kind of access. But let me show you what we have here. If I right-click this rule and choose Properties, there are 5 tabs that come up, and you're going to see that this is a type of a network rule that's evaluated 3rd of 6. On the Source Network tab, it says that this rule applies to traffic from these sources. So if I'm looking at it from the internal perspective, the internal network is included as a source network here. And the destination network is everything external, so basically the internet. So all traffic from the internal network to the internet will be subjected to this rule. And what kind of a relationship do we have here? Well, in general, these days, many organizations are using network address translation to get out to the internet. So this is a network address translation rule rather than a route rule. And the NAT address selection says use the default IP address. Now, what this basically says is Threat Management Gateway is going to use whatever IP address is the default on the external adapter, whatever the destination network's IP address is. However, I can create additional rules that say, oh, I want to use a specific IP address. If I add that IP address to the network adapter, I can then use it as a specified IP address here. You'll notice right now the only address I have is 192.168.160.2. Or I can use multiple IP addresses, but I'm not going to be worrying about that right now. So that is a NAT rule. Let's take a look at a route rule. VPN clients to the internal network. Actually, let's look at this rule. I'm sorry. Let's look at the internal to perimeter relationship rule. This is a little bit more useful. We're going to see a similar set of 5 tabs. The source network is the internal network. The destination network is the perimeter network. So all traffic from internal machines to the DMZ. The network relationship is a route. And you're going to see that there are no NAT address selection options that need to be selected because we're not using NAT, we're using a routing relationship. And you can see some of this stuff on the routing tab as well. There's a whole lot of routes going on. Now, let's talk about system policy rules, which is a group of almost 60 predefined access rules that control traffic to and from the local host network and threat management gateway servers specifically. These rules enable and manage basic capabilities in Threat Management Gateway, such as allowing remote management of the threat management computer. Now, that's just one very basic thing controlled by system policies, and we're going to look at some of the system policies in just a second. As an example, the Global Mantics will enable remote management of the Threat Management Gateway server from an internal Windows 7 computer named GM-PC-1. But before we go over and do that demonstration, I want you to see a look at the web resource that I have listed on your screen. This web resource shows you all 59 of the rules as they currently exist in Threat Management Gateway, and you can see that there are a lot of rules. Let me go back up to the top and we'll start from there. For example, allow access to directory services for authentication purposes, and this is allowed from the local host to the internal network. This basically allows Threat Management Gateway to authenticate, which is a good thing. Allow remote management from selected computers to Threat Management Gateway. And you can see that there are 3 groups of computers that are allowed this kind of access. Remote management computers, array servers, enterprise remote management computers to the local host. If you don't need remote management, you can disable this rule. Well, we're not going to disable this rule, but we're going to manage this rule when we get over to the Threat Management Gateway server, which we're going to do right now. And as you can see, I'm in the firewall policy area. And if I go down to the bottom of the tasks area, you're going to see that I have 2 options. Edit system policy and show system policy rules. I'll start by showing the system policy rules. And you can see that there are a whole lot of them. And they appear now before the firewall policy rules. That's because these are evaluated first. So the system policy rules are evaluated before any firewall policy rules are evaluated. And you can see that we have those rules that we talked about before, and that these look just like normal rules in Threat Management Gateway. If I right-click one of these rules and choose Properties, you're going to see that we have the exact same tabs that we have in other areas. The General tab, what's allowed or denied, Protocols, Source, Destination, and you'll see all of this happen as we go through the course. The Schedule tab is particularly interesting. For example, you could allow for particular rules to have them only allowed at certain times of the day. So perhaps web access is only enabled between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. for whatever reason. You could do that with a rule in Threat Management Gateway. What I want to do, however, is edit the system policy. This is the easier way to edit the system policy because the rules are grouped nicely. So this is the system policy editor, and I'm interested in remote management and managing the Microsoft Management Console. This configuration group is enabled, and I'm going to go to the From tab, and you're going to see that this rule applies to traffic from these sources. What I really want to do is add a computer to the Remote Management Computers area. So I'm going to edit that group, select it and edit it, and then I'm going to add a computer. So I'm going to add a system, a computer, and I'm going to do gm-pc-1. Now I don't know that machine's IP address, so I'm going to click Browse, and it'll bring up a Find Internal IP Address window, and I'll click Find, and you see that that comes up as 10.1.1.0. And then OK, and now I've added that computer to that Enterprise Remote Management Computers, or the Remote Management Computers group. I could also directly add a computer. I've already added this computer to the Computers group in Threat Management Gateway, but if I wanted to, I could add that computer directly as well. Then you would see that GMPC-1 shows up on the list directly, allow computers to manage the Threat Management Gateway system remotely. So it's in two places. It's in Remote Management Computers, and I've added it here. And we can do that. That's allowed. When we're done, we click Apply to apply the new settings. And that's it. And if we go up to Rule 2, we'll then see that GMPC-1 is now on the list. When you're done managing system policies, click Hide System Policy Rules, and you'll get back to your normal, generally used set of rules. You're not going to do a lot with system policies after you have your system in production. Now, let's talk about firewall policy rules, because this is where you're going to operate most often, between here and web access policies and some of the more user-facing policies that are present in Threat Management Gateway. Firewall policy is comprised of access rules, which are outbound rules, and you can see a little diagram on the left-hand side of your screen, which basically shows you an outbound rule. You have an internal client, basically a client browsing to a website. Threat Management Gateway assesses the rule, and it's an access rule that allows the traffic so that it gets out to the website that you see the little arrow. Basically, access rules allow or deny outbound traffic from a protected network based on specific criteria you specify. You can allow traffic based on the fact that it's all traffic of a particular type, selected protocols, or all outbound traffic except selected. So you could say I want to do something with all outbound traffic except just HTTP, for example. And you can limit what's allowed based on a number of variables that you're going to see throughout this course. Web publishing rules are inbound rules. So this is where you would publish a server out to the internet, and then a web publishing rule would allow inbound access to these protected networks. And if you look at the little diagram on your right, this is a simplistic view of how a web publishing or a publishing rule in general works. The diagram on your right is a web publishing rule because the arrow points to a web server. Basically, an external client, for example a customer, browses to the GlobalMantic's website. The publishing rule allows access to the DMZ, or the perimeter-based web server, and you can see that there's a little arrow pointing to the website. There are also what are called server publishing rules, which are used for all other generally non-HTTP or HTTPS-based services, inbound access to protected networks. We're going to cover a myriad of web and server publishing rules and other lessons in this course, including the web and server publishing overview lesson, the publishing websites lesson, and the publishing Outlook, Outlook Web Access, and Active Sync lessons in this course. When it comes to the order of the rules that you see in Threat Management Gateway, rule order matters. You may recall seeing the numbers 1 through 59 for the system policy, for example. Those numbers aren't just to give them a number to make them easy to remember. That's the order by which the rules are actually going to be evaluated. The last rule that you have for a firewall rule is generally a deny all rule, which disallows any traffic that you haven't specifically enabled. Microsoft has a number of best practices when it comes to how you create your rules. First of all, you create any global deny rules that you're going to have in place. These are rules that are designed to deny access to all users to specific resources. For example, you might use such a rule to block access to all users to adult-themed sites. You don't want them out visiting those kinds of sites on your network, so you put a global deny rule at the top of your list that basically says there's no traffic allowed to any adult-oriented sites. Now, there's one exception to this basic deny thing that I just mentioned. I just said global deny rules are generally first. Don't forget, a blanket deny rule should be the last on your rule set, and there is a blanket deny rule added by default is a default rule to your threat management gateway rule set. So just leave that intact. Next, Microsoft recommends you create your global allow rules. This is the opposite of a deny rule. A global allow rule will allow you to access specified resource or resources. So you may want to allow all access to financial type websites. You can have a global allow rule that allows that access so that it gets hit. If someone tries to browse to a financial website, then they're allowed to do that without any other restrictions taking place. Or you might use such a rule to enable all DNS traffic to traverse the threat management gateway system from the internal network to the external network. You might recall that we actually did that in this course. We created a rule that allowed all DNS traffic to traverse threat management gateway. Next up, Microsoft recommends you start getting more granular by creating rules for specific computers. These are rules that allow or deny access for specific computers or groups of computers. And you've seen groups of computers already in this course. For example, the management computers group that we saw earlier. You might use such a rule to create the ability for the IT department to have full access to the internet for testing, or someone in the IT department, or a computer in the IT department. Getting even more granular, you next have rules that are for specific users, URLs, MIME types, and publishing rules. These are rules that include additional networking information beyond simple categorizations. For example, you might say, okay, I'm going to allow access to a specific URL that later on would have been denied for some reason. For example, suppose that you want to block access to financial sites, but there's one you want to allow access to. You could have an earlier rule before the deny rule that actually says, I'm going to allow access to www.cbsmarketwatch.com, although financial sites are then blocked by a rule later on. Because the allow rule came first, that traffic will be allowed. These kinds of rules allow you to create policies for specific resources, users, groups of users, websites, and what have you. We're going to discuss publishing rules later in this course, so I'm not going to cover them right now. And then Microsoft recommends everything else. Anything that doesn't fit those categorizations, then you put on your list of rules. Any other rules that may not have been encompassed in the previous categories. And then you end the whole thing with a blanket deny rule. And you can see a little picture of that on your screen. This ends your rule set basically with a deny the request unless it is specifically allowed. This is considered a security best practice for pretty much all firewalls these days. You only allow the traffic that's specifically enabled. You don't allow anything else. There was a day in security land where it was the other way around. You allowed everything and then you had to block what you didn't want to have happen. That's changed a lot. Now you basically have to allow things based on the criteria you specify. We're now going to go over to the Threat Management Gateway system now, and we're going to take a look at the rules that we have in place on the Threat Management Gateway server. You'll notice that I'm on the firewall policy area, and I've got basically 4 rules. I have one rule here, and then I've got a default web access policy group that's created 3 rules. And these have been modified a little bit, but they're still good for demonstration purposes. I'm going to hide this for just a minute. So the first rule we have here is a DNS rule that I've created that allows traffic from the perimeter network to the domain controller, which is our DNS server as well. We then have web access policy. We're going to block web destinations. So we're going to deny traffic of HTTP and HTTPS from the internal network to these kinds of categories. And we're going to be talking much more about these categories in this course in another lesson. But for now, I just want you to understand that we're blocking based on these categories among a few others. So anything that's a destination of an obscene or tasteless destination or an illegal drugs, any user, it's going to be blocked. We also block access to malicious destinations. And then we separated this out in another lesson in this course. But we can actually apply different rules if we wanted to. So I could allow access if I wanted to malicious destinations and block these other categories. These categories are defined by a service that Microsoft provides. Next, we have our first allow rule. And you can see that we are allowing DNS. This is what we did before in this course. HTTP and HTTPS from the internal network to external and perimeter networks for all users. So basically, if a user has browsed to a site that doesn't hit one of these areas, so if they've browsed to www.trainsignal.com, TrainSignal is not an anonymizer, it's not a gambling site, it's not a spyware site, it's not a malicious site. So it falls to this rule. This is an allow rule, and it will be allowed based on this rule because there's nothing in this rule that would prohibit the user from going to trainsignal.com, assuming they're browsing with HTTP or HTTPS. If the user tried to use FTP to get to trainsignal.com, it would fall through to this blanket deny rule because there's no FTP rule specified above it that would be an allow. If we wanted to allow FTP, we'd have to add FTP to this list of protocols for web access for all users. And if I right-click this rule and choose Properties, you'll notice that we have a number of properties pages, 9 pages to be exact. And you're going to see these pages in action throughout this course, but let me quickly run through what each one actually does. The General tab is just the name and description and whether or not the rule is enabled or disabled. On the Action tab, you can allow or deny a rule, and you have to choose one or the other. We'll discuss allowing and denying more fully later on in this course. On the Protocols page, you need to choose which protocols this rule will apply to, and we've chosen DNS, HTTP, and HTTPS. Remember, back in one of the configuration lessons in this course, we added DNS to this rule so that internal servers could use external DNS servers if necessary. If you wanted to add additional protocols, you can simply click the Add button, and you'll get a list of protocols broken down into different categories. Next, we have the internal networks, or the source networks. And this one, notice it doesn't just say internal, it says internal networks only. This is a group that I created, and the reason for that was because I wanted to be able to have the ability to have multiple internal networks. So if I click Edit and go to the Networks area, you'll see that I have internal selected. This is a network group that I've created, and you're going to see how to create network groups later on in this course. I know I keep saying that a lot, but it's the truth. Next, we have our destination areas, our destinations, external and perimeter networks in this case. So any traffic that this rule applies to is destined for the external network, again, generally the internet, or the perimeter network. To which users does this apply? You can have a rule that applies to specific users. So, for Global Mantics, you could allow marketing to go out to particular areas where you wouldn't allow sales, for example. Then we have a schedule. And you'll notice that we have always, weekend, and work hours. And if I choose work hours, I'm going to basically get 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, where this rule is going to be allowed. Or I can choose just on weekends, or I can choose always. Then we have content types. What kind of content do I want to allow? Well, in this case, we're allowing all content types, but in this case, anything that's transmittable over HTTP is basically allowed. And I can choose if I want to basically just allow audio or images or HTML documents. I could actually block text, video, virtual reality, markup language, the whole 9 yards if I really want to. So if I want to allow my users to go out and browse the internet, but I want to block all video, I can do that with this rule. I'm not going to, but we could do that. Then we have malware inspection. We'll be talking about malware inspection in the malware inspection lesson in this course, but this allows you to make sure that the content that your users are browsing to does not contain malware that would then be brought back onto your network. In this course, we're going to be talking about a number of different ways that you can create firewall policy actions. And these are all going to be encompassed eventually in the firewall policy, but you see them broken down into things like web access policy and email policy and all that good stuff. You can publish a number of different resources out through Threat Management Gateway, including Exchange information, mail servers, SharePoint sites, websites, and non-web server protocols. For example, you could publish one of Global Mantic's DNS servers out to the internet if you wanted to. You can also create an access rule, which allows an internal network or a protected network access to the outside world, which we will be doing. And you can configure voice over IP or client access. Many of these policy options will be covered in this course. But there's some good stuff that comes with rules management as well in Threat Management Gateway. You can search rules based on criteria you specify. For example, you can search for all deny rules, and we'll go over and do this in just a second. You can also create rule groups. Threat Management Gateway 2010 allows you to create groups of rules to make them easier to manage. Some policy creation activities are grouped by default. For example, you saw the web access policy rules grouped together. You can enable or disable rules based on their groups. So you can actually disable or enable an entire group all at once. There are some restrictions, however. You can't simply add rules to an existing group. If you want to add a rule, you actually have to remove the group and then recreate it with all of the desired rules included. Let's go over to the Threat Management Gateway server now and take a look at rules management. Here I am, back on the Threat Management Gateway server console, and you can see that I've re-enabled the system policy rule display. And the reason I've done that is because we don't really have enough firewall rules to search for them to make things interesting. Where searching comes in handy is when you have a list of a few dozen rules and you can't remember where everything is. Let's say you know you want to manage a DNS rule, but you can't remember where it is. Up in the search box, simply type DNS and hit enter. And you'll get a list of all the rules that mention DNS, 2 from the system policy in this case, and 2 from our firewall policies. We have that initial DNS rule that allows DNS server traffic from the perimeter network to come to the internal network. And we have a web access policy group rule that enables DNS traffic to come from the internal network to the external network. So it's a quick and easy way that you can find rules. Now, if you want to group rules, it's more interesting if you have multiple rules, but you can actually group a rule of 1 if you want to. So I'm going to right-click this rule, and I'm going to choose Create Group. I'm just going to call it Initial DNS Rule. And you'll see that I can then collapse the groups based on whatever criteria I like, basically. And if I want to, I can right-click at a group and choose Disable or Enable. If I disable on a group, you're going to see all 3 rules go disabled. If I enable a group of rules, all 3 rules then become enabled. But I can still do it on a rule-by-rule basis as well. So not only this singular rule becomes disabled. And I think that I accidentally wiped out the grouping. So we'll create a group. Web Access Policy Rules. There we go. The last topic we're going to talk about is Threat Management Gateway log file management for the firewall. You want to make sure that your Threat Management Gateway log files are in a location that has adequate disk space and performance to handle your organization's logging requirements. You can change logging options from the Logging and Reports area of the Management Console. For this course, we're going to keep the defaults. The SQL Express database that was installed with Threat Management Gateway is what we're going to use, and it's stored at the default location. However, if you have a central SQL server that you use for everything else, you can use that for Threat Management Gateway logging if you like. And you can actually choose which fields are logged. But remember, the more you log, the more disk space you're going to need to store all of that information. The nice part about all of this logging is that then it's queryable using any SQL query. And you can pull granular information and run reports for managers, for example, that say, here's what your people have been doing on the internet. There are some things to keep in mind when it comes to log file size. And there's also something else I want to mention. It's called the log queue location. By default, the total size limit for the logs is 8 gigs. And the system wants to maintain at least 512 megs of free disk space for logging. From a maintenance method, what's going to happen is Threat Management Gateway will delete log files as necessary in order to maintain space limits, and any files that are older than 7 days will get wiped out. You can also change the log queue location. Sometimes there's so much activity on the Threat Management Gateway system, the SQL Server can't necessarily keep up with everything that's necessary. So basically, what happens is Threat Management Gateway writes everything out to a temporary log file, and then when it has time, it writes everything into the Threat Management Gateway SQL Express database. So if log entries are generated faster than they can be formatted, or there's no connectivity to the SQL Server database for some reason, you don't lose those log files. They just end up in a different place for a little time, and then they'll make their way into the SQL Server database when time permits. Let's go over and look at where log files are managed in the console. This time I've selected the Logs and Reports option, and you're going to see that I have a Logging tab, as you might expect. And over in the Logging Tasks area under Configure Logging, we have Configure Firewall Logging and Configure Log Queue that are items of interest for this particular portion of the course. When I choose Configure Firewall Logging, I have some options. I can choose to which location I want to store the logs, SQL Server, to a SQL database, or to a file. And I can choose which fields I want to log. So you can see that there's a lot of information being logged right now. But I can choose more. I can choose which network interface, the GMT log time, Greenwich Mean Time. All kinds of information. There's already a lot of stuff being logged, but I can log even more if I wanted to. So I can choose or deselect fields that I don't need, which fields are going to be logged for the logging purposes. And when I come over here to the log tab again and click options, you'll notice that there are some options. Where am I going to store the log file? Well, I'm going to store them in the Threat Management Gateway installation folder. And here's where those log file storage limits are. 8 gigs, 512 megs, 7 days. I also mentioned the log queue. So here I can click Configure Log Queue. And when log records are generated faster than they can be written into the database or formatted, they're stored in the log queue. By default, the log queue is in the logs folder, but if you need more disk space, you can have this go to some other area of the system. We covered quite a bit in this lesson, starting with managing Threat Management Gateway networks. You got an overview of how networks operate and interoperate with one another. We discussed web proxy authentication options, and then you learned the differences between route and network address translation. And again, you're going to see that happen a little bit more later on in this course too. Next, we discussed rule types, and you made sure you understand that rule order has an operational impact. Next, we talked about firewall policy actions, which you'll be seeing much more of in this course. And then you discovered ways that you can quickly find rules and manage rules in Threat Management Gateway. And we wrapped up with a discussion on log file management. This is a great supporting resource if you're interested in learning more about system policy rules and the descriptions of each one. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.